On July 19, 1974, at Mount St. Mary's Hospital in Lewiston, New York, an 82-year-old man drew his final breath. His heart, weakened by decades of living in the shadows, finally gave out. But this was no ordinary death. The man lying in that hospital bed was Stefano the Undertaker Magaddino, the most powerful crime boss in American Mafia history, a man who had ruled an empire spanning from Ohio to Montreal for over half a century. Yet when death came for him, he died almost alone, abandoned by the very organization he had helped build, his fortune stolen, his legacy shattered. The irony was suffocating. The Undertaker, who had buried so many of his enemies in the Magaddino Memorial Chapel, would end up needing a funeral of his own. But unlike the grand ceremonies he once orchestrated, his passing marked not triumph, but the bitter end of a dynasty destroyed from within. This is the untold story of how the longest reigning mob boss in American history fell from absolute power to disgrace, and how his own greed became the weapon that killed him. Born on October 10, 1891, in the blood-soaked Sicilian village of Castellammare del Golfo, Stefano Magaddino entered a world already at war. His family was locked in a brutal feud with the Bucciato clan, a vendetta that would chase him across continents and define his entire existence. When Magaddino was just a boy, his enemies murdered his brother Pietro in Sicily. The message was clear. In this world, you either kill or you die. In 1909, at 17 years old, Magaddino arrived in America with nothing but rage and ambition burning in his chest. He settled in Brooklyn's Williamsburg section, joining the Castellammare clan, a tight-knit network of Sicilian immigrants who would become the backbone of the American Mafia. Here, he found his cousin Joseph Bonanno, and together they began building what would become one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. But the vendetta followed him. In 1916, Camillo Caiozzo, a member of the Bucciato clan, murdered another of Magaddino's brothers in Brooklyn. This time, Stefano didn't wait. He orchestrated Caiozzo's execution, and in 1921, when police arrested him for the murder, Magaddino stood before them with cold defiance. The charges were dropped for lack of evidence, but the heat was too intense. He fled north to Buffalo, disappearing into the anonymity of upstate New York. It was the best decision of his life. Buffalo in the early 1920s was a city of opportunity, especially for men who understood that laws were just suggestions written by people too weak to break them. When Giuseppe DiCarlo, the local crime boss, died in 1922, Magaddino seized control of the Buffalo family. He was 31 years old and just getting started. Then came Prohibition, and with it, the golden age of American organized crime. While other mobsters fought over speakeasies in New York and Chicago, Magaddino looked north across the Niagara River into Canada, where alcohol flowed legally and abundantly. He saw what others missed. Niagara Falls wasn't just a natural wonder, it was a superhighway for smuggling. The border was porous, the river was navigable, and the fog that rolled off the falls provided perfect cover for nighttime operations. Magaddino established the Magaddino Memorial Chapel, a legitimate funeral home on Niagara Street that became the perfect front for his operations. The irony of his nickname, The Undertaker, was too perfect. While he buried the dead by day, he smuggled the living by night, or rather, smuggled enough Canadian whiskey and wine to flood every speakeasy from Buffalo to Cleveland. His trucks crossed the border daily. His boats navigated the river in darkness. And when authorities got too curious, he simply hid the contraband in coffins. Who would dare search a casket? The money poured in like a waterfall. By the early 1930s, Magaddino's bootlegging operation was generating what would be tens of millions of dollars in today's currency. He controlled everything that moved across the Niagara frontier: liquor, gambling, labor unions, and eventually narcotics. His territory stretched from Ohio to Ontario, from Buffalo to Montreal, a criminal empire larger than some European countries. But Magaddino was different from other mob bosses. While men like Al Capone and Lucky Luciano courted publicity, Magaddino operated in complete shadow. He drove modest cars. He lived in unremarkable houses. He never drew attention to himself. To most residents of Niagara Falls, Steve Magaddino was just a friendly businessman who owned a funeral home and occasionally bought rounds at the local bar. They had no idea that the quiet man sipping coffee in the corner was orchestrating murders, drug trafficking, and extortion rings that spanned international borders. In 1931, when Charles Lucky Luciano and other mob leaders created the Commission, the governing body that would oversee all organized crime in America, Magaddino was one of the 7 founding members. He was now not just a boss, but a kingmaker, one of the handful of men who controlled the entire American underworld. His power was absolute. His empire was untouchable. Or so it seemed. The cracks began appearing in the 1930s. In 1936, rival gangsters, angry over Magaddino's territorial ambitions, decided to send a message. They planted a bomb at what they believed was his home on Whitney Avenue in Niagara Falls. But they got the wrong address. At 6:30 in the morning on May 19, 1936, the bomb detonated, not at Magaddino's house, but at his sister's home next door. Arcangela Longo was killed instantly. Her 3 daughters were injured. Her husband was away in New York City, miraculously spared. Magaddino's response was swift and brutal. Within weeks, Frank Lotempio, a Buffalo hood suspected of orchestrating the attack, was found shot to death. No one was ever charged, but everyone knew who had ordered it. The message was clear: attack Magaddino, and you die. But the attempt rattled him. For the first time, Don Stefano realized that power made you a target. He moved to Lewiston, to a house on Dana Drive, part of what locals called Mafia Row, where he lived surrounded by his sons-in-law, all made members of the Buffalo family. He was building a fortress. In 1957, Magaddino helped organize what should have been his crowning achievement, the Appalachin meeting. After the murder of Albert Anastasia, mob boss Vito Genovese wanted to legitimize his power by holding a national summit of all the mafia families. The meeting was originally planned for Chicago, but Magaddino convinced them to hold it in rural Appalachin, New York, at the estate of his subordinate, Joseph Barbara. He argued the countryside would provide privacy and security. He was catastrophically wrong. On November 14, 1957, when state troopers noticed dozens of luxury cars with out-of-state license plates converging on Barbara's estate, they set up a roadblock. Mob bosses fled through the woods in their expensive suits. About 60 were arrested. For the first time in history, law enforcement had undeniable proof that a national crime syndicate existed. The Appalachian fiasco changed everything. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had spent decades denying the mafia's existence, could no longer ignore reality. He created the Top Hoodlum program and declared war on organized crime. The mafia's books were closed. No new members could be made for nearly 2 decades. And many bosses blamed Magaddino. It was his idea to hold the meeting in Appalachin. It was his subordinate who hosted it. Within a year, someone tossed a hand grenade through Magaddino's kitchen window. It failed to detonate, but the message was received. Don Stefano, you've become a liability. Yet somehow he survived. Through the 1960s, while other bosses fell to prison sentences or assassins' bullets, Magaddino remained standing. He was too careful, too paranoid, too shrewd. Even as federal investigators circled closer, building wiretapping operations and cultivating informants, they couldn't touch him. He had never spent significant time in prison. He had mastered the art of insulation, keeping layers of subordinates between himself and any criminal activity that could be traced back to him. But in 1968, everything collapsed. On November 26, 1968, FBI agents arrested Magaddino on Ferry Avenue in Niagara Falls. He was sitting in his car, calmly eating a bag of nuts, when they surrounded him. Federal agents simultaneously raided his Lewiston home, his son Peter's house, and the Magaddino Memorial Chapel. In total, they arrested 9 men, quickly dubbed the Niagara Falls 9 by the press. But it was what they found that destroyed Magaddino's empire. Inside a suitcase hidden under Peter Magaddino's bed, agents discovered over $500,000 in cash, a staggering sum in 1968, equivalent to more than $4 million today. The money represented years of profits from illegal gambling, narcotics, extortion, and loan sharking. It was the jackpot federal investigators had spent decades trying to find. For the Buffalo crime family, however, the discovery wasn't just evidence of criminal activity, it was proof of betrayal. Magaddino had been telling his captains and soldiers for years that money was tight, that profits were down, that there wasn't enough to pay Christmas bonuses. He pleaded poverty while sitting on a fortune. Retired FBI agent Donald Hartnett later explained, at that time, Magaddino had been telling his underlings that money was tight and he could not afford to pay them Christmas bonuses. People began to stop trusting him when we found all that money. The fury within the organization was instantaneous. Soldiers who had risked their lives and freedom for Magaddino realized they'd been lied to. Captains who had delivered millions in profits discovered their boss had been skimming from the top while crying poverty. The loyalty that had held the Buffalo family together for half a century evaporated overnight. By late 1968, the Buffalo family had fractured into warring factions. In early 1969, the captains held a meeting in Rochester. Without Magaddino, they voted him out. After 47 years as boss, Don Stefano was deposed in a bloodless coup. He wasn't killed. The old tradition still commanded some respect. But he was finished. Magaddino was left with only a handful of loyalists, his elderly sons-in-law and a few aging soldiers who remembered the old days. The vast empire that had once stretched from Ohio to Montreal was gone. The respect he had commanded from New York to Chicago had evaporated. The man who had ruled longer than any boss in American Mafia history was now just an old man clinging to the remnants of a dead dynasty. The federal charges against the Niagara Falls Nine were eventually dropped in 1971 after a judge ruled that the FBI's wiretapping operations had been illegal. It should have been a victory for Magaddino, but by then it didn't matter. The damage was done. His own organization had already convicted him in their court, the only court that really mattered. For the next 5 years, Stefano Magaddino lived in a strange limbo. He was technically still a boss, but only of a ghost crew, a handful of old men who met occasionally to reminisce about better days. The new leaders of the Buffalo family, first Salvatore Pieri, then Samuel Frangimore, actively worked to erase Magaddino's influence. The funeral home on Niagara Street, once the nerve center of a criminal empire, became just another failing business in a declining industrial city. His health deteriorated rapidly. The heart that had sustained him through 7 decades of violence, betrayal, and stress began to fail. He spent his final years in and out of hospitals, a frail shadow of the man who once commanded absolute loyalty. On July 19, 1974, Stefano Magaddino suffered a massive heart attack at Mount St. Mary's Hospital. He was 82 years old. Unlike the dramatic deaths of other mob bosses, Anastasia shot in a barber's chair, Carmine Galante murdered over lunch, Magaddino's end was quiet and clinical. There were no shootouts, no dramatic last words, no spectacular betrayals. Just an old man dying in a hospital bed, his empire already dust. His funeral was held at St. Joseph's Catholic Church, and he was buried at St. Joseph's Cemetery in Niagara Falls, the city he had controlled for half a century. The ceremony was modest by Mafia standards. The grand turnout of bosses and soldiers that would have attended a decade earlier never materialized. Most of the organization had already moved on. The irony of Magaddino's life is almost poetic in its cruelty. He survived assassination attempts by bombs and grenades. He evaded murder charges and FBI investigations. He outlasted every one of his contemporaries on the original commission. Al Capone died in 1947. Lucky Luciano in 1962. Vito Genovese in 1969. Carlo Gambino would outlive Magaddino by only 2 years. Don Stefano should have died as the ultimate survivor, the last man standing from the golden age of the American Mafia. Instead, he died as a cautionary tale, a monument to the truth that greed is more dangerous than any enemy. The $500,000 hidden under his son's bed destroyed him more effectively than any bomb or bullet ever could. It revealed the lie beneath his empire, that the man who preached loyalty and omerta had been stealing from his own family all along. In the years after his death, Niagara Falls changed dramatically. The factories that had made it prosperous closed. The tourists stopped coming. The hotels and restaurants that once thrived downtown became vacant lots. The Mafia's grip on the city loosened and eventually disappeared entirely. Legal gambling at the Seneca Casino replaced the illegal operations Magaddino once controlled. The funeral home on Niagara Street was eventually seized by the city for unpaid taxes. Today, few people remember Stefano Magaddino. His name doesn't carry the recognition of Capone or Gotti. There are no movies about him, no HBO series glorifying his reign. Even the Buffalo family he once commanded barely exists anymore, reduced to a skeleton crew operating in the shadows of a forgotten era. But for those who study organized crime, Magaddino remains a fascinating figure, a man who achieved what no other mob boss ever did. He ruled for 52 years without being convicted of a serious crime. He built an empire that spanned international borders. He sat on the commission that governed the entire American underworld. He survived longer than every single one of his peers. And then he threw it all away for $500,000 in a suitcase. Perhaps that's the real lesson of Don Stefano's life, that survival isn't the same as victory, that living long doesn't mean living well, and that the greatest danger to any empire isn't external enemies, it's the rot that festers within. Magaddino survived assassins, rivals, and federal investigations, only to be destroyed by the one enemy he couldn't escape, himself. The Undertaker, who had buried so many others, ultimately buried his own legacy. And when his heart finally stopped in that hospital room in 1974, the question wasn't whether he would be remembered, but whether he deserved to be remembered at all. For a man who had commanded absolute power for half a century, dying forgotten and disgraced might have been the cruelest fate of all. In the end, Stefano Magaddino's death was exactly what he had spent his entire life avoiding: ordinary, unremarkable, and devoid of the power that had once defined him. The longest reigning boss in American Mafia history died not with a bang, but with a whimper. Alone in a hospital bed, his empire already dead, his name already fading into the obscurity he had spent 7 decades fighting against. That is the true tragedy of The Undertaker's final funeral. Character count: 18,947.